Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Veil of the Forest. Holly Arnold had always found solace behind the lens of her camera. As a freelance photographer, her assignments took her to some of the most remote and hauntingly beautiful places across the UK. But it was the Isle of Wight, with its eerie coastlines and mysterious woodland, that beckoned to her this time. It was said to hold a veil between the living and the dead. Holly dismissed such talk as local folklore, but it piqued her curiosity nonetheless. She arrived on the island just before dusk, the September air carrying a chill that clung to her skin. Her destination was an old, dense forest known as Whitewood, infamous for the strange lights and ghostly whispers reported by locals over the centuries. Legends spoke of a hidden gateway within the forest, a passage between worlds, but no one had ever found it, at least no one who came back. Holly was determined to capture its essence in her photographs, to expose the myth for what it really was, a figment of overactive imaginations. As she made her way through the winding paths, towering trees loomed above, their twisted branches resembling skeletal arms reaching toward the darkening sky. The deeper she ventured into the forest, the more the world around her seemed to shift. It grew unnaturally quiet, with even the rustling of leaves ceasing, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. She paused, pulling out her camera to capture the strange atmosphere. As she focused her lens on a particularly gnarled oak, something flickered in the corner of her viewfinder. Holly lowered the camera, squinting into the trees. At first she saw nothing, but then there it was again. Faint light just beyond the shadows. Intrigued, she adjusted the camera settings and took a few shots. The light, though dim, seemed to dance, moving deeper into the forest. Without thinking, Holly followed. The deeper she went, the thicker the fog became, and soon the trees themselves seemed to shift in place, as if guiding her towards something unseen. That's when she saw a tall, wrought-iron gate, hidden deep within the forest, nearly consumed by the moss and vines. She raised her camera and took a shot. The flash illuminated the structure for a split second, casting long, ghostly shadows. Her heart pounded as she approached the gate, one hand outstretched to touch the cold metal. The instant her fingers brushed against it, the forest roared to life. The silence shattered, replaced by the low hum of whisperers, like a chorus of distant voices carried on the wind. Holly spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Shadows moved between the trees, more lights appeared to pale, ethereal figures flickering in and out of existence, almost too fast to be seen. But her camera captured them. Every click of the shutter revealed ghostly shapes that her eyes could not fully perceive. Figures with hollow, staring eyes, their mouths agape in silent screams. Holly felt a cold sweat break out along her spine, her pulse quickening as the figures grew clearer with each shot. She realized, too late, that the lights had led her into a trap. The gate creaked open behind her with an agonizing groan. Cold air, far colder than any autumn night should bring, rushed out from the dark void beyond the gate. Holly turned to run, but the earth beneath her feet shifted, pulling her back toward the portal. Shadows wrapped around her legs like tendrils, dragging her closer. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. With desperate hands, she clung to the camera, her only weapon, snapping pictures in a frenzy. The images it captured were terrifying. The ghostly figures were no longer in the distance. They were right behind her, their translucent faces leering with grotesque anticipation. Their mouths, once agape, now twisted into malicious smiles as they reached for her. The air grew thick with their presence, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In a final act of defiance, Holly aimed her camera toward the gates and took one last shot. The flash illuminated the inside. What she saw defied comprehension. A vast, endless expanse of darkness, with countless figures floating in its depths. Some appeared human, others were twisted, monstrous shapes that writhed and slithered within the void. And then, standing at the center of it all, was a figure unlike the rest. It was tall, clad in tattered black robes that seemed to blend into the darkness itself. Its face was hidden beneath a veil of shadows, but Holly could feel its eyes on her, piercing and malevolent. It raised one bony hand, beckoning her into the abyss. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her, and Holly tumbled forward, the world around her dissolving into cold, consuming darkness. She thrashed, trying to pull herself back, but the shadows tightened their grip, dragging her toward the figure. With one last, desperate cry, Holly was swallowed whole by the gate. She awoke to the sound of birds chirping and the warmth of the sun on her face. Gasping, Holly sat up, her heart racing. She was lying on the forest floor, the camera still clutched in her trembling hands. The gate was gone, and the forest looked normal. Peaceful, even. Had it all been a nightmare? Her fingers fumbled with the camera, pulling it to her lap as she scrolled through the images. The first few were what she remembered as strange lights in the woods, shadowy figures, and the gate. But the last image, the one she had taken before she fell, was different. There was no gate, no dark figure. Only the forest, empty and still. Holly stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she thought she saw something, just a blur, near the edge of the frame. She zoomed in. There, hidden among the trees, was the figure. The one from the gate. Its face still obscured by shadows, its hand still outstretched, beckoning. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and Holly's camera shut off with a soft click. The battery had died. But in the silence that followed, she heard it, a voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind. Come back, she never did. But the figures from her photographs, they followed her even in the daylight, always watching, always waiting, for her to return to the veil of the forest. The next time she snapped a picture, Holly knew they would finally have her. Holly spent the next few days back in her small rented cottage on the Isle of Wight, trying to make sense of what had happened in the forest. She scrolled through the images again and again, each one more chilling than the last. The shadowy figures and that beckoning, veiled entity haunted her waking hours, and her sleep was no refuge. Nightmares plagued her every time she closed her eyes. In them, the figures came closer, the gate opened wider, and she always stood on its threshold, teetering between two worlds. But it wasn't just the nightmares. In the daylight, Holly felt it, the presence. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched. Shadows flickered in the corner of her vision, figures she couldn't quite catch. It wasn't paranoia, she knew they were real. She would leave the camera on her desk and glance back only to find it slightly shifted from where she had left it. Sometimes she heard faint footsteps outside her window at night, or the creak of floorboards in the hall when she was alone. It was getting worse. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Holly decided she couldn't stay inside anymore. She needed to confront whatever was haunting her. Grabbing her camera, she set out toward Whitewood again. The familiar path felt different now, heavier, darker, as though the trees themselves knew she was coming. The forest didn't welcome her this time, it had been waiting for her return. The moment she crossed the boundary into the woods, the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her shoulders. The eerie silence was back, but now it was accompanied by an unnatural chill, far colder than it had been before. Holly's breath came out in visible puffs, and her fingers trembled as she held the camera to her chest, its weight both a comfort and a burden. As she ventured deeper, she saw the first of the lights again faint, flickering between the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. Her heart pounded, but she pressed on, following the ghostly glow. The path twisted and turned, and soon she was lost in the thick fog that had started to roll in. Her footsteps crunched on the forest floor, echoing unnaturally in the quiet. Then, just ahead, she saw it. The gate. It was just as she had left it, iron and ancient, half consumed by the earth and the relentless growth of the forest. The veil between worlds hung in the air, invisible but palpable, as though the atmosphere itself was charged with something unnatural. A voice whispered in the wind, low and faint, but unmistakable. Come back. Her heart raced. She knew that voice. It had been haunting her since she first stumbled upon the gate. But now it was clear, more insistent. With trembling hands, Holly raised her camera and snapped a picture of the gate. The flash illuminated the iron structure for a brief moment before plunging her back into the eerie darkness. She took another step forward, then another. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, drowning out her own thoughts. She was close now. The veil of the forest was thin here. Too thin. Something moved behind the gate, a shape shifting in the fog. Holly's breath caught in her throat as she aimed her camera and took another picture. The flash revealed more of them, figures standing just beyond the gate, their faces obscured, their bodies blending with the shadows. They were waiting. And in the center, standing motionless, was the tall, veiled figure she had seen before. It raised its hand, beckoning. "No," Holly whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "I can't, I won't," but even as she said the words, she felt the pull. It wasn't physical, but something deep inside her was being drawn toward the gate. Her fingers shook as she tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't obey. The forest around her seemed to shift, the trees leaning closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "You must." The voice was louder now, closer. It echoed in her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her question her own will. "You belong here." Holly's chest tightened as the ground beneath her began to ripple, like the very earth was alive. The camera slipped from her hands, falling to the forest floor with a dull thud. She stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The gate creaked open, and the figures beyond began to move. Holly's pulse quickened as she fought to regain control of her own limbs. She had come this far, she had to resist. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she tore her gaze from the gate and turned to run, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her feet finally obeyed her command. But the forest wasn't done with her. The trees shifted again, twisting the path, blocking her escape. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. The figures were behind her now, closing in. She could feel their cold breath on her neck, their icy fingers grazing her skin. "Come back," she burst through the underbrush, branches clawing at her face and arms. The fog grew thicker, swallowing her whole as she ran blindly through the woods. But no matter how far she ran, the gate loomed in her mind, a dark stain that refused to fade. Finally, exhausted and trembling, Holly collapsed to the ground. Her heart thundered in her chest as she looked around, disoriented. The whispers had stopped. The shadows no longer moved. But she wasn't safe. She glanced down at her hands, now trembling uncontrollably. The camera, which she thought she had dropped, was back in her hands, the strap wrapped tightly around her wrist. She hadn't been holding it a moment ago, she was sure of that. And yet there it was. With a shaking breath, she brought the camera to her face and turned it on. The last image, the one she had taken of the gate, flickered on the screen. But it wasn't just the gate anymore. The figures, they were closer now. Much closer. Their faces were clearer, their eyes hollow and dark. And in the center, the veiled figure stood just beyond the threshold, its hands still outstretched, its head tilted as though waiting. A single word appeared on the screen. "Welcome." The camera flickered, the screen going black. Holly's heart dropped. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The gate was in front of her. Open. Waiting. And she realized, with a deep, sinking dread, that the veil wasn't just a place in the forest. It was in her now. Holly Arnold was never seen again. But the locals still speak of her, the photographer who vanished in Whitewood, leaving only eerie, unexplainable photos behind. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the soft click of her camera in the woods, capturing the veil between worlds. And if you listen closely, you might hear a voice, faint and distant, whispering for you to come back. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.